This is the intentional collapse using the climate agenda of our energy, our transportation, we talked about EVs, and our food supply.
Welcome back to Mic'd Up, Militants. I'm your host, David Gordon. Climate change, according to the enviro-capitalist opportunists at Apple Computers, is a, quote, defining issue of our time. As such, the tech powerhouse is pledging to make all its products carbon neutral by 2030. And for those who don't know, aka normal people, carbon neutral means that any CO2 released into the atmosphere from a company's activities is balanced by an equivalent amount being removed. Again, more carbon dioxide scaremongering from New World Order schemers intent on canonizing the pop science of climate change despite its doubtful methods and conclusions. And Apple is hardly alone in crusading against so-called global warming. Other mainstays of big tech have piled on the bandwagon as well. Google, for example, claims, quote, climate change is one of humanity's most urgent challenges, and likewise is setting a 2030 goal of net zero emissions. Microsoft has pledged itself to a similar course. The Paris Climate Treaty, aimed at curbing carbon emissions by force of law, looms large in the minds of many world corporations after all. To talk about all this, today we're joined by Marc Morano. Marc is executive editor and chief correspondent for CFACT's award-winning ClimateDepot.com, a news and information service he founded in 2009. He's also the author of The Great Reset, Global Elites, and The Permanent Lockdown, Green Fraud, Why the Green New Deal is Even Worse Than You Think, and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. How's it going, Marc? I'm glad to have you on with us today.
Thank you, Dave. Happy to be here. Appreciate it.
Great. Well, to get started with the show, we wanted to give the audience a snippet from a recent Apple commercial where they very publicly pledge allegiance to dubious climate science and the draconian emissions policies that climate zealots are ramrodding down our throats. So let's take a look and then we'll have our reactions.
As you can see, we've innovated and retooled almost every part of our process to reduce our impact on the planet. But there's still a lot more work to do.
And there's something else we wanted to share with you.
You're not trying to bribe Mother Nature with Apple swag.
It's Apple's very first carbon neutral product.
I want to see you do more of this.
You will.
When?
By 2030, all Apple devices will have a net zero climate impact.
All of them?
All of them.
They better.
They will.
Well, it looks like Mother Nature needs to hit the treadmill. But aside from that, Marc, reaction.
All right, this is Apple products virtue signaling. First of all, they are guilty, if you want to use that word, let's put it this way, using their worldview, they are guilty of climate sins. And what I mean by that is they are responsible for the disposable plastic phone culture. And who else but Apple makes a new version that's just slightly different from the year before, incremental differences, and then gives you all the incentives to trade in your old one, buy the new one, creating a mess of old, unused phones. They're full of plastic. They're full of glue. They're not operable. You even have the EU now going directly after Apple and Google phones and Samsung saying we need to have replaceable batteries so that people don't have to rely, because when a battery goes, then it's like the phone's not even worth fixing. So they're making disposable products that require lots of rare earth mining and require assembly in places like China. Now, what's interesting about this is they have this Mother Nature figure, and they're claiming everything they're doing is carbon neutral. All that means is they rake a ton of CO2 production into a product. But hey, we give money to some certified organization that offsets our carbon. So that makes us carbon neutral. And just to give you an idea of what these offsets involve, it could be buying up land in Africa so that the local Africans can't develop their land, so that white wealthy Westerners like Tim Cook and his Apple board can continue to make their products and make pledges like they're carbon neutral. It could be the planting of trees. It could be Carbon emissions trading at one point was a big thing, and that sort of faded over the years. But that is when they mean carbon neutral. We're going to make a mess. We're going to dig up the earth. We're going to use China with the lowest human rights and environmental standards. And now, one last point on this is CBS this morning interviewed Apple on this. And they actually made a deal to go after Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, for doing business in the state of Texas, because Texas is anti-LGBTQ. It's very conservative. How do they justify doing business in this essentially fascist state? And that wasn't it. I mean, that wasn't the only thing, because they also were criticizing Apple they're criticizing Apple's practices for dealing with the United States government and everything. So the implication is dealing with the state of Texas is worse than dealing with China. And we know Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, a few years ago actually did a video in which he proudly declared that China and Apple's values on climate change are perfectly aligned. And this is a country that, of course, is a one-party rule, using Uyghurs, human rights violations against Uyghur slaves, underage kids in Africa for the mining, for EVs, for solar panels, for the whole green agenda that Apple fully supports. This is the world we live in, where Texas is considered, immoral and disgusting and fascist, but hey, business in China, thumbs up, you're doing great.
Well, hey, not to mention the fact that China is the world's biggest polluter and carbon emitter, right?
Yeah.
But going on from there, it sounds like, reading between the lines, which you've laid out quite clearly, actually, is that these companies are rather hypocritical, and perhaps they have cynical motives at play for some of these anti-carbon campaigns that they're waging, because, of course, corporate culture and, the kind of soulless capitalism that they're embracing. At one time saying, oh, we're against carbon emissions. But again, like you say, putting out a new model of the iPhone, what is it, iPhone like 16, iPhone 17, SE,
I'm on Android,
X
so I don't know. Not that Android's much better, but I'm Android world, so I don't keep up with the Apple.
Sure.
I do use a MacBook, but not an Apple phone.
What's behind the hypocrisy? What is that?
Well, this is, and Apple's not unique here. First of all, I was going to mention the CBS segment. Not only did they chastise Apple for doing business in Texas, the fascist state of Texas, but they also chastised them. How dare you advertise and have a presence on Twitter, because Elon Musk is a white supremacist and anti-Semite, et cetera, et cetera. Again, CBS never mentioned China once, how Apple, which is where they make the iPhones, now they're trying to expand out to India. Well, what you're seeing here, and in this video with Mother Nature, they actually pledged at one point to remove all carbon from the atmosphere, which we can get into in a minute, but that's an absurd thing to say, because we're carbon-based and we would all die. I mean, we would starve the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. But essentially, this is the whole corporate structure that's really revolutionized over the last 15, 20 years. And it's embodied in environment, social governance regulations. It's all a way designed to bypass democracy, because you have corporations, the government, ideological interest groups, and non-government organizations like the World Economic Forum and the United Nations colluding on how to get their agenda done without having that little thing we used to call the messiness of democracy. In other words, these corporate boards are all beholden to this woke crowd, and that includes climate, the energy agenda, the transgender agenda, the critical race theory agenda. So at Apple, Tim Cook, his constituency, aside from being beholden to China for the cheap labor to crank out their disposable iPhones, his constituency is the woke activists in the United States and that corporate structure where they all kowtow. Now, if you remember 50 years ago, the left would have railed against big business and corporations. And frankly, they would have railed against the Pentagon, the war machine, anti-Vietnam. They would have hailed the Pentagon Papers as the greatest exposure of the government lies. Fast forward from the early 1970s to now, and the left, they don't complain anymore because they're in control of these corporate boards. They're in control of the corporate culture. They're in control of the FBI and the CIA and the Department of, the Defense Intelligence and all of our intelligence agencies. And we see that in action when it comes to the collusion on Twitter, the collusion on all the social media, whether it's enforcing the COVID narrative, the climate narrative, the LGBTQ transgender narrative, the critical race narrative. So Apple's Apple's CEO Tim Cook in that whole video was all about keeping Apple's bona fides with this controlling, progressive, woke agenda that America finds itself held hostage to in the year 2023.
Would you know how to explain the gospel to a friend? I'm teaming up with Church Militant, a masterclass on the theology of St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. I'm Chris Plants. Join me for a new approach to Scripture. See you there.
How does this idea of stakeholder capitalism and guys like Larry Fink and BlackRock and institution like Vanguard, saying we're not going to direct investments, we're not going to direct money to you, we'll leave you out of our mutual funds unless you adopt certain corporate practices that are very, quote, environmental friendly or gay friendly, and we have kind of big money now policing the policies that corporations are embracing. How does that fit into this particular puzzle vis-a-vis Apple, vis-a-vis Google, and all of the big tech giants?
I mean, every single one you just mentioned is steeped in this environment, social governance, in this woke agenda. What the key of this whole agenda and why it's so brilliantly conceived, I mean, it's evil and it's destructive to capitalism. First of all, you said stakeholder capitalism. 1971, the World Economic Forum is founded by Klaus Schwab, the head of it, the man who heralds the Great Reset, the man who says the crisis is upon us, COVID after COVID, and it's the climate crisis.
Right. He had Spectre also in the James Bond movies, I believe.
Yes. So what they're doing with environment, social governance, instead of actually introducing the Green New, they did introduce the Green New Deal in Congress, but instead of scheduling it for a vote and actually having hearings in town halls and congressmen hearing from their constituents and the switchboards on Capitol Hill lighting up for a vote, they're never going to vote on it. Why? Why has it not been voted on? They don't need no stinking vote. And that's the brilliance of this. When John Kerry can go to corporations and tell them that you have to go along with this agenda, or we're going to make sure the Securities and Exchange Commission, for other federal agencies, either don't certify you, regulate you, fine you. We have Janet Yellen all in now telling banks they have to up their commitment to the net zero climate agenda and these temperature goals, which a UN scientist in discovered email said the 2 degree temperature or 1.5 degree temperature goal was quite seriously and literally pulled from thin air. It's meaningless as far as the earth goes. They just use it as a political cudgel to make people go along. So what happens is, instead of actually having legislation to force energy companies to go a certain way, they have equity asset firms, and State Street, BlackRock, and these equity asset firms. The three of them together are larger than the entire U.S. economy. And Larry Fink himself has said we need to use coercion to get this agenda across. And he's talking about all the broader agenda, not just climate, but again, the transgender, the gay, lesbian, and also the critical race and equity agenda and everything along those lines.
Well, it's funny you say that they are not putting this up for a vote, but that would be very dangerous. For one, it risks political capital, right? And for two, then if you have legislation, you got to run things through the courts. You're going to get a nationwide injunction possibly put on something as violative of.
The last thing they want is democracy, because democracy is going to slow them down. We know this. Okay, remember the last when I was telling you about Tim Cook saying that he and China's values are perfectly aligned. In my book, The Great Reset, I go back 2 decades. And I show that Tom Friedman, New York Times, on the pages of the New York Times, praising China's one-party rule because they can just get things done. He called the leadership enlightened. They don't have the roadblocks and the gridlock, and they can go forward with this visionary agenda. Justin Trudeau said he admired China's basic dictatorship. You have our energy secretary, Jennifer Granholm, saying the same thing. You have the UN chief saying the exact same thing. You have Klaus Schwab saying the exact same thing. You have academics saying the same thing. So we know that the entire ruling class loves the Chinese model for the world. Fast forward, March of 2020, COVID emergency declaration. Suddenly, presidents and governors and every blue state governor and mayor became a dictator overnight. No vote on the most consequential decisions of our life. Mask mandates, vax mandates, school closures, church closures, stay-at-home orders, weddings and funerals canceled, medical procedures canceled. It was all imposed on us by unelected bureaucrats through an executive branch that didn't have to have a single vote. None of that was voted on. That is the goal. That's where ESG comes in. They want to keep that. That's why they want to declare a climate emergency, because it would give Joe Biden 130 new executive powers. And NBC News said this would be exactly the similar powers that we had during COVID, except this time for climate. So that's the juice what they already have. But just so you understand, the ESG and the banking and the corporate government collusion, the idea here is behind the scenes, they're withholding money from companies unless they go along with an agenda that was never put up for a vote to the public.
Right, and it's very unpopular.
Agenda opposed. Sorry,
it's an unpopular agenda, and people are like,
yes,
why aren't these companies pumping the brakes on this? We're creating a bunch of electric cars that are just sitting and rotting on lots, and people are like, aren't you losing money? But what people don't understand is that these companies are playing the long game, and they're calculating out that if we lose funding from these big boys like BlackRock, like Vanguard, like State Street Bank, then it's going to cost us more than if we temporarily lose a bunch of money creating unwanted electric cars, because eventually we're going to be able to, do something with those, parlay those into some kind of a profit. So all they're doing is a bottom line, 50 years out economic analysis, and it leaves a lot of people scratching their heads, which is exactly why this stakeholder capitalism, in my view, this ESG, is perhaps it's the Phantom Menace. We're quoting movies here. we got James Bond, now we're going Star Wars. But it's the Phantom Menace that is at the heart of the threat to the world, because you have some technocrats, you have some bankers that are pulling the strings of the marionette and making world public policy behind the scenes without being elected, without being vetted through voters. Not that matters very much, because voters, you just give them some Obama phones and they'll pick you or whatever. But, we don't even have that firewall, right? Can you explain just how dangerous this ESG thing is?
Well, let's start two things. I'm going to talk about the stakeholder capitalism, ESG, and then I'll talk to you about electric cars, because it's a great example of the ideology, and then the EV mandates are the ideology in action and practical. You can see it in the news every day. So 1971, Klaus Schwab starts the World Economic Forum. His brainchild is the stakeholder capitalism. Now, that's just a phrase. I don't know if half your audience really knows what that word means, but let me explain it in a simple term. I'm not saying your audience is uninformed, but it's just one of those wonky inside baseball terms.
Well, we did a whole show on this about a month and a half back, so I'm hoping some of them are return customers.
Yeah, okay, that's great then. That's good. But just to simplify it, stakeholder capitalism is turning capitalism and free markets on their head, because it basically says we're going to evaluate companies not on profit loss, not on return to investors, not on the efficiency of their delivery of a product and quality of a product or good and service. We're going to evaluate companies now in businesses on how well they are good stewards of not only the planet, but of the social structure that we set out. In other words, you've got to be a company that's open to the transgender, the LGBTQ, the critical race, the equity agenda, the climate agenda. And that's how you're going to be evaluated. Doesn't care if there was a great video, which I always show at my talks. It's simulated of how this whole system works with ESG as it's being implemented. It has a Texas oil wildcatter go into a bank to get a loan, and it's a young 20-something sitting behind the loan desk, and he's like, I hire good people, we have a lot of oil, we're going to make energy, it's going to be a very profitable company, our products in demand. And they're like, okay, well, you're in a very dirty business, sorry, we can't give you this loan, but wait, all's not lost. Do you have any women in your company? He's like, no, it's just me and my partner who's a man. Okay, have you ever identified as a woman? And then they continue on. Do you have paid for abortions in your company? Do you have services to pay for transgender surgeries, for sex change surgeries? And had he done all of these other things, he would have theoretically got approved for the loan. But because he just had a profitable business with a good business model and men to make it happen and business to make it happen, he wasn't getting the loan. That's how ESG works. They can starve the companies that they don't like. This is also tied to a central bank digital currency. Joe Biden just introduced that in the United States. He has a presidential commission now looking at it. It's now coming in Europe. The Bank of England said the quiet part out loud, and this is very ESG and stakeholder capitalism. Government will deem in a central bank digital currency, a cashless society where the government's going to have digital control, that you can only spend money on what the government deems sensible. So to give you a practical application, the United Nations and MasterCard joined up with a new credit card. It's called the Dichotomy credit card. This is 2 years ago now. It's a card that monitors your carbon footprint. And when you hit your carbon max, your footprint max, it cuts off your ability to spend money. This is an actual card. Central bank digital currency would do the same thing except wider. Now that MasterCard, theoretically, it's still voluntary. You're not forced to get that card, but these are what you'd call trial balloons and test markets. They're setting up that system. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now with the federal government. You have them telling banks they have to go along with this. Now let me give it to you a more practical application of how EVs mandates have occurred. There has not been a single vote on banning gas-powered cars in the United States Congress. Even California, the epicenter of banning gas-powered cars in favor of EV mandates, has not had a single vote of the California legislature on this. Here's how it came about. Gavin Newsom issues an executive order. The unelected bureaucrats at the California Air Resources Board go along, set a timetable, I think it's 2033, maybe 2035, for the banning the sale and production of gas-powered cars in the state of California. 17 to 20 states have trigger laws that follow whatever California does. I live in the state of Virginia. We have a Republican governor now because of the COVID pushback and the transgender pushback and the critical race from the schools. But our Republican governor is powerless to stop the gas-powered car bans coming to Virginia because the previous administration had a trigger law that will follow whatever California does, and he can't overturn it because the Democrats are still in charge of the Senate. Just to give you an idea.
Sure.
Then you have corporate banks led by one out of Australia saying they're not going to give out car loans to people who buy gas-powered cars. Then you have the World Bank, former President Nicholas Stern, at a World Bank meeting, tell the automakers that they're not going to get financing for the continued production of gas-powered cars. Then you have cities in Colorado and California, test cities, very liberal, that are now banning the construction of new gas stations. So even if you still have a gas-powered car, you're going to have gas station shortages. You're going to have trouble getting a loan. The automakers are going to have trouble going along with it. And the automakers go along with this because they're getting massive amounts of money in government funding, subsidies with the EV mandates. We have now reached a point in 2023 America that goes back to the 1980s of East Germany under Soviet bloc control with Erich Honecker as their dictator, which literally told the citizens of East Germany, the government is only going to allow you to have one approved car, the crappy East German Trabant, which was this little car that was absolute crap. People would be on waiting lists for 5 to 10 years. You can look this up. Now we're in a situation where in the United States of America, the Biden EPA is so enamored with what California does. Through the unelected bureaucracy of the EPA, they're now restricting gas-powered cars, heading us right to that same gas-powered car ban nationally.
Absolutely.
The automakers are making a lot of money off of this. They're going along. They have all these subsidies, all the mandates. They're getting bailouts, and they're getting the idea, they're getting threatened, too, that if they don't meet these targets, the government's going to come in and put further restrictions, which would, of course, cut into their profits.
For sure. And it's really, we're both Catholics. This is getting... One does not have to wear a tinfoil hat to be like, this is getting a little mark of the beastie where it's, I can see how you are going to say no one can buy or sell or engage in commerce unless we go along with this. But let me ask you something. Because you were talking about all of this effort that's being put in to circumvent legislative control, the way the founding fathers dreamt it up, that policy would be, at least at the federal level, created by a legislature, and there's checks on that, and there's balances. We have the presidential veto, and of course we can elect a new legislature. The left and these guys pulling the strings behind the scenes are going to such great lengths to circumvent that. Why? What is with the fixation of all things on CO2 when it's really not been proven that there's any link and I come from a family of geologists, practicing geologists, that there's any link between human activity and global warming, global temperature rise. For example, the temperatures were 5 times higher in the Cretaceous period when dinosaurs were running around. Yeah. We've had multiple ice ages. And even if we do take for granted there's a minimal nexus between human activity and climate change, whatever, then you think it's a disaster. It's funny, I always laugh when I'm out in public and the store clerk is like, well, it's hot today, that global warming. It's like, yes, exactly. You can really feel that 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit per decade that the Earth is warming. It's really coming out today. But that's the level of the, quote, crisis we're at. So what is with the monomaniacal fixation that the left has on CO2? What's behind it? What's driving it?
Okay, before I just get directly to CO2, it's beyond CO2 for a very important reason. CO2 and global warming, climate change is the current most favored nation. It's the most favored issue in which to impose their long-held agenda. Just so we understand, in my book, The Great Reset, I go back to the Roman Republic and its descent into an empire. I'm citing a BBC historian talking about the abuse of emergency powers. And that's what Joe Biden wants to do, is declare a climate emergency. So the emergency power abuse led from the Roman Republic to descent into an empire, centralization of power in the Middle Ages, this concentration of power of Adolf Hitler in the Germany in 1930s. It led to the abuses we saw with 9/11 emergency powers, which we're still living under, the Patriot Act, and domestic surveillance. This is the end of our freedom. And then, of course, the COVID emergency declaration, which only ended because the Republicans won the Congress and forced everyone's hand. After years of running, now they want to declare the climate emergency. So it's not so much that they've always wanted to regulate CO2 because they're just focused on that. It's they were always wanted to regulate CO2 because it was the everything, all of the above, all in one basket thing. Because CO2, essential for life. Humans inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. It's literally part of everything. We're all carbon-based life forms. And so if you regulate CO2, you can literally control every aspect of our society and civilization. That's the key. Why? Now, one last caveat before I just run into the history of CO2 is they also realized that they failed for decades because the public just was you can look at Gallup polling. Concern over global warming didn't really change much from the late 80s all the way up to COVID. COVID was the game changer. They realized that you could scare people about a virus. You could tell people they had to mask up, stay at home, get a vax, or grandma would die. They had the specter of kids dying. They had the specter of deaths exceeding the Spanish flu of 1918. And it worked. That fear worked. So they were jealous of that, and now they want in on that. And that's why they want this climate emergency. In terms of CO2, we are in a CO2 dearth right now, the lowest CO2 levels pretty much in the longest time history of Earth. 90% of Earth's history has had higher CO2 levels and warmer temperatures. 90% of Earth's history has been colder than today. 90% of Earth's history did not have ice at both poles like we do today because the Earth was too warm. So we're in the coldest period geologically speaking, and we're in the lowest CO2 geologically speaking. When I worked at the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, we had Will Happer from Princeton University, the foremost expert on the greenhouse gas, hundreds of peer-reviewed studies, PhD physicist from Princeton, and he testified that the Earth was currently in a CO2 famine. Now, I can also point you to Joe Biden's administration right now. National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration will show you a chart. You can go to a government website and see that 500 million years ago, the temperature was much higher with much higher CO2 levels than we have today. I can go to the United Nations report and show you in 1990, their first UN climate panel report, that the medieval warm period was much warmer than current times. They later had scientists. We had a scientist testify in the Senate. That UN scientists are saying we have to, quote, get rid of the medieval warm period because it was inconvenient. By 2011, 11 years after the first UN report, they wiped out the medieval warm period. I can now refer you to Joe Biden's EPA chart, which shows a heat index of the 1930s. You thought this summer was hot? The Joe Biden Environmental Protection Agency heat wave index, which charts are still available on their website, and I have screenshots because I'm expecting them not to be, show that the heat waves are about 10 times worse than anything we're experiencing today. In other words, 75% of all states had their heat wave records broken before 1955. And 80% of man-made CO2 came after World War II. So this was the 1930s when you couldn't say, well, that CO2 caused that. So the idea that carbon dioxide is driving the climate is scientific nonsense. The idea that it's the control knob does not hold up. There are quite literally hundreds of factors that influence our climate. Tilt of the Earth's axis, water vapor, clouds, volcanic dust, the sun, and ocean cycles. And you can go on and on.
Plate tectonics.
Absolutely. Plate tectonics. And what they've decided to do is pick out one politically selected factor out of these 100 and say, this is what we have to do to control it. In this way, by going after CO2, just so we're clear, they can ban pizza ovens, they can ban gas stoves, they can go after your appliances, they can go after your vehicle, they can go after airline flying, they can go after how you construct your house. We have a new UN report out, not making this up, David, just 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, that they're going to go after modern construction. They want steel and cement restricted in favor, I'm not making this up, of stone, earth, and bamboo. And we're literally going
we're
back to
living in like tiki huts. You know?
Yes, that's what they're saying, because it's unsustainable.
Well, you know what else? How about this? Can you speak to this for a second? Because you know what else produces the quote-unquote pollutant of CO2, which is what kind of the Obama Supreme Court ruled CO2 could be regulated as a pollutant, right? And I believe that's the Clean Air Act. But they can also regulate meat production because animals fart. They breathe out CO2. They create these greenhouse gases.
The methane.
And
the animals
are polluters.
Okay, now
ourselves.
You're bringing me. Here's the bottom line on that. Okay, this is the intentional collapse using the climate agenda of our energy, our transportation. We talked about EVs, and our food supply. With the food supply, John Kerry just this summer, our U.S. climate envoy of the Biden administration, announced that we could no longer, our food was unsustainable, that we have to redo all of our farming practices and all of our livestock meat eating practices.
And that's the bugs, right? Is that where we're all supposed to eat a juicy bowl of bugs?
Yes, so that's where they're headed. So the idea here is nitrogen-based fertilizers, which give us high yield agriculture, which is feeding the world, the yield per acre, which is actually what you want with farming, the highest yield per acre, because then you need less farmland. And when you have less farmland, you don't have to clear forests and trees to clear for more farmland, and you don't have to harm endangered species, etc. You want as high a yield per acre. So they're saying now that the nitrous oxide created from the nitrogen-based fertilizer, which is a greenhouse gas, is driving the planet. They've gone even further. Scientific American said that our consumption of meat is causing the urine to have too much nitrous oxide. So we're literally, our urine is now, human urine is considered a warming agent. What you mentioned, the 2007 Supreme Court ruling, that was CO2 can be regulated as a pollutant under the 1990 Clean Air Act, which it was never originally intended. So now human beings who inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. Our breath, human breath, can now be regulated as a pollutant under the Environmental Protection Agency through the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1990, never even mentioning climate. So that's where we are. When it comes to the meat eating, they're going after the methane, and John Kerry specifically said that. Apparently, farming agriculture has been around for thousands of years. In 2023, the earth just can't take it anymore. We have to revamp it all. So they're collapsing high-yield agriculture. We saw it happen in Sri Lanka, where they went into starvation. The presidential palace was overrun. We saw them doing this in the Netherlands, where the farmers revolted. And here's the kicker. 10,000 family-run generational farms, small, medium-sized farms, were the ones that were facing closure in the Netherlands. Guess who was going to be able to absorb the climate compliance costs ruled by the net zero agenda? The big agribusinesses, the big Chinese-owned firms, the big Bill Gates-owned agriculture, they can afford all of this. And so now in America, Bill Gates is the single largest farmland owner, followed closely by China in terms of owning farmland in the United States. And we are told Bill Gates' number one goal is to get the Western world, Europe, Australia, Canada, US, to eat fake synthetic meat. Now, Bill Gates and Richard Branson have invested billions in lab-grown meat. Lab-grown meat is where you get the stem cells from a cow, a sheep, a pig, mix it with the fetal blood of the same animal, put it in a petri dish, then you mix it, put it in a steel vat, and an amorphous blob grows. No eyes, no ears, no brain, no bone structure. It's just a blob of tissue, which they're calling meat, and it technically is meat because it's genetically derived from the stem cells of meat. They grow this through additives, antibiotics, and then they get it and they pull it out like taffy and run it through machines, not making any of this up. World Economic Forum brags that they can then get this meat and put it in a 3D printer and with all the right additives and food coloring and texture additives, and you have your fake lab-grown meat. This has now been approved because Bill Gates is so wealthy and powerful by the United States FDA for human consumption in the United States in 2023 for the first time ever.
Well, I hope we've whetted everybody's appetite out there who's watching this. No, this goes along with a pattern of elevating ultimately the earth and creation itself, which is for human beings, above human beings, and by that fact, belittling human dignity. And you see this with things like even banning DDT. How many people in Africa have died of malaria because DDT was banned in the name of environmental activism? It's a pattern that goes back a really long time, and it shows a basic worldview, which is why I want to ask you, why it seems like the Holy Father, Pope Francis, he is largely on board with saying, yes, we have to do things to control CO2. Now, Catholics, we agree that there is a duty. God gives us stewardship over creation, but creation is for all of the human race to flourish, and that means generations beyond us. So we have to take care of the earth. There's no doubt about that. And it's not just Pope Francis, it's John Paul II, it's Benedict XVI. We do have a legitimate duty to care for creation so that it can produce abundantly for the following generations. However, it seems like Pope Francis perhaps is being hoodwinked, and I'm not calling into question his good faith in wanting to solve a problem that he sees or is being told that could rear its head for following generations if, the climate alarmists would have us believe that if we don't take drastic action, the ocean is going to spill over and destroy all of us, and the polar ice caps are going to melt, and there will be no polar bears to look at the zoo unless, everybody has to drive a dysfunctional electric car. But what do you think is behind, the Holy See? And it's taking a more aggressive stance on this, although doctrinally it's absolutely right. But I'm not sure, and I'm dubious that it's applying the doctrine to the present facts correctly. What say you to that?
All right. Well, yes, excellent analysis there. Let's start with the creation care, which as Catholics and as Christians and as anyone who studies the Bible, that's absolutely one of our moral central duties is the creation care, plant, animal life. And here's the bottom line. Country like the United States, since the first Earth Day in 1970, we have radically improved our air and water quality. We have, at the same time, radically increased our population and economic growth. So you can do both. The cleanest economies, the cleanest environments around the world are the most prosperous nations with the freest markets. The filthiest places are the ones that are under the most control or undeveloped. And you could go back to Eastern Europe. They had the worst environments under the central planning of the old Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. You can now look at the developing world with their massive poverty. I've been to, throughout the developing world in Kenya and South America, you have the huts made of dung. They're burning wood inside, breathing it in. Their rivers and sewers are filthy. They don't have modern sanitation. The poverty, the 1 billion people without running water and electricity are not, energy poverty equals environmental destruction. You have to require slash and burn agriculture. So that's a premise to start with. Now, I'm well versed in Pope Francis. I went to the Vatican Climate Summit in 2015 in Rome at the Vatican, when what I called an unholy alliance. Pope Francis joined up with the United Nations, and it was a bunch of population control pro-abortion, long-time climate activist with the United Nations who teamed up with the Vatican to support his encyclical on the environment. Now, there's a lot of good in his encyclical, a lot of theological good, explaining about creation care.
Absolutely.
Where Pope Francis went off on the tracks, in my opinion, is he decided that carbon dioxide was the satanic gas instead of the gas of life, and he accepted that premise pushed by the United Nations, and that ended up skewing this encyclical. I think he's at this point because he recognizes that for societal transformation, climate is one of the best ways to get wealth redistribution, equity agenda, and help the poor, in his estimate. Now, remember, he comes from a South American sort of poverty perspective, and I think he's looking at the UN agenda, which is all about just basically paying poor countries to stay poor, but at least giving them all this money and taking from the wealthy countries to a climate fund. He likes the politics of that. And I think so because he likes the politics, he went along with their scientific claims. So if you go to my website, Climate Depot, I have several big feature reports of dozens of pages each on the Pope's encyclical with real analysis, point by point, on all of his climate claims and some of his environmental claims, but mostly his climate claims. And I just wish there was a way. Now, you mentioned the previous popes, Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II. They also held climate summits at the Vatican, but they did something very different than Pope Francis. They allowed contingents of climate skeptical scientists to participate, and the Vatican really didn't take a position on climate science. When Francis came in 2015, he quite literally banned any dissenting scientists from attending that summit.
Obviously, that tends to be something that's not good. We don't want mono-party rule in terms of, if you've even, groupthink's really dangerous. If you've got a bunch of people in a room and everybody's thinking the same thing, the old adage goes, somebody isn't thinking until things are truly settled. I mean, there can be a point where it would be pointless to dispute the law of gravity or something like that, or the second law of thermodynamics or something, things that are kind of beyond reproach. But I think this is where Pope Francis has been perhaps misled by the popular narrative, which has taken such a firm stance that the science is so settled and that you have to be, again, a tinfoil hat wearing nut, the kind who, would doubt anything, would think that we haven't landed on the moon, for example, or something like that. They're trying to make it analogous to that you are a science denier. And, that's not, there are a lot of good scientists on this side that I think are more honest and are saying, hey, this is problematic because you're creating a causal connection between what man is doing and the temperature of the earth that there's not sufficient grounds for actually calling proven. It has not been demonstrated. And I feel like Pope Francis has been swept away by the popular narrative and perhaps by a cadre of advisors who maybe have been swept away by the popular narrative. But I like to withhold judgment on the intentions of the Holy Father himself. That's me. I mean, I think, what's out there is out there, and it's good that you bring your point of view for the viewers. I don't want to impute to the Holy Father any ill motive or,
I'm just giving the motive. I'm just saying his background in poverty in South America, and I think the idea of social justice, he sees in that because the climate movement has all of that language. So I think there's a natural interplay on those issues with him. So I'm not necessarily saying it negative. I'm just saying that's his appeal to that movement because it's about the social justice warriors and wealth redistribution and alleviating poverty through direct aid. And I think that's where he got caught up with the climate. And then he took the CO2 claims along with the politics.
Sure. Okay, we are at a hard break, as you know, so we have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. And I just want to give you the floor to say to the audience, especially about corporate America and its embrace of particularly climate politics, but environmentalism in general and the virtue signaling that's coming out of big tech. Give the audience anything that you want to say on that you think that they would need to know going forward.
Well, I'm going to try to give you hope here because so much of this is negative and it just sounds so hopeless in many ways. And we're just going down the wrong track. And you really have Republicans in Washington who are just generally clueless. Republican leadership is clueless. A lot of good senators and congressmen. What the greatest pushback to this entire agenda, first of all, was the lowest level of politics, the school board level. They pushed back the hardest on the COVID theater, masking of kids, the angry parents declared domestic terrorists by the Biden administration, using the 9/11 Patriot Act and all that to do that. But they also pushed back against the critical race and against the transgender ideology, and that toppled the Democrat Party machine in Virginia. After that, every major city from Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Washington, San Francisco, LA lifted their mask and vax mandates after these elections. Democrats did internal polling. Then you have Republican governors and Republican attorney generals who are destroying right now the environment social governance movement, to the point where Larry Fink just about a month ago said he doesn't even like the term anymore. They've made it toxic for these corporations. You have State Street, one of the big equity asset firms, pulling out and saying they're not going to be pursuing, at least their intent is, we don't know how it's going to play out, environment social governance. We have governors like Kristi Noem in South Dakota pushing back on the central bank digital currency. As soon as the public is aware of what's happening, this could collapse like a house of cards. Their whole plan for success is doing this without democracy, without the public's awareness, and they've been getting away with it for a long time, and COVID really accelerated it. But my hope is, and with the work that people like Ron DeSantis have done in Florida on COVID, and also on ESG and the woke agenda, you take that nationally and you take that to all the other states, and you could have real power pushback. We just need more and more people to wake up. One last point, you said it, the key. This is not a conspiracy at all. Everything in my book, everything in my talks, it's all public information from mainstream sources. I lay it all out. You don't need secret documents, anonymous sources, not a zero. It's all out in the open.
Marc, thank you so much. Very well said. You're a treasure trove of knowledge on this issue. Thank you for your time. Thanks for coming on Mic'd Up. Guys, this is David Gordon from Mic'd Up. I'm going to be signing off this week. Please remember to support us, not only with your views, but also, if you have the means, with your wallets. It takes a lot of money and manpower to produce this content. Please keep coming back and keep us in your largesse, if you would kindly. Thank you so much. God bless, everybody. See you next week.